The door slammed with such force that the window panes rattled in their frames, and Faith Ellsworth stood frozen in the center of her modest homestead cabin, watching the dust settle where the government inspector had just departed with a smile that made her stomach turn. Cornelius Blackthorne had made his intentions clear during his so-called inspection, his eyes roaming over her in a way that had nothing to do with evaluating whether she'd met the requirements of the Homestead Act, and everything to do with what he expected in exchange for his signature on her approval papers. The year was 1889, and Faith had spent 3 backbreaking years turning 160 acres of Texas prairie near Madisonville into something resembling a working farm, only to have this corrupt official tell her that her efforts might not be quite enough unless she was willing to be more accommodating to his personal requests. Faith's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her wooden table, her knuckles going white with the force of her anger and fear. She was 24 years old, alone in this world since her parents had died of fever during the journey west, and this land was everything she had fought for, everything she had poured her soul into creating. The cabin she'd built with her own hands stood solid and true. The fields she'd plowed stretched green with winter wheat. The well she'd dug provided clean water, and the small barn housed the 2 horses and handful of chickens she'd managed to acquire through careful saving and harder work. By every measure outlined in the Homestead Act of 1862, she had fulfilled her obligations, had proven up her claim, had made improvements worth far more than the required amount. But Cornelius Blackthorne held her future in his ink-stained fingers, and he'd made it abundantly clear that the law meant nothing if he decided it didn't. She walked to the window and stared out across the land that had become her entire world. The February afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie, and in the distance she could see her neighbor's cattle grazing along the property line. She'd met Benjamin Crawford only a handful of times since he'd purchased the ranch adjoining her homestead last spring, but each encounter had left an impression she couldn't quite shake. He was perhaps 27 or 28, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of sage after rain, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. He'd been respectful, even kind, offering help during last summer's drought, and never once making her feel small or incapable the way so many men did when faced with a woman working land alone. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention, and Faith watched as a rider approached her cabin at an easy canter. She recognized Benjamin's gray gelding immediately, and her heart did something complicated in her chest as she smoothed her hands over her worn calico dress and stepped outside to meet him. He reined in his horse and touched the brim of his hat in greeting, but his expression was troubled as he swung down from the saddle. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of someone raised in Texas but educated back east. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I just passed Cornelius Blackthorne on the road, and the way he was grinning made me uneasy. He's been here before, hasn't he? For your homestead inspection." Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and fury that this situation existed at all. She'd been raised to be honest, to believe that hard work and integrity mattered, but the world had proven far more complicated than her parents' simple lessons had prepared her for. "He was just here," she admitted, her voice tight. "And he's made it clear that my improvements might not meet his standards unless I'm willing to provide him with certain favors that have nothing to do with farming." Benjamin's jaw tightened, and something dangerous flashed in those sage-colored eyes. "He propositioned you." It wasn't a question, but Faith nodded anyway. He suggested that a woman alone might need a man's guidance to understand what's really required for approval. He said he could be very helpful to someone willing to show proper appreciation. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, and she wrapped her arms around herself despite the mild temperature. I refused, of course, but now I don't know if my claim will be approved, and if it's not, I lose everything. 3 years of work, everything I have in this world. Benjamin removed his hat and ran a hand through dark hair that had been pressed flat by the crown. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the neat cabin with its stone chimney, the sturdy barn, the fenced fields, and the well-maintained property that spoke of endless hours of labor. When he looked back at Faith, his expression was resolute. "This is one of the finest homesteads I've seen in Madison County. You've more than met every requirement, and anyone with eyes can see it. Blackthorn is corrupt, and he's using his position to prey on vulnerable people who have worked hard for what they have. Knowing it and proving it are different things," Faith said quietly. "He's a government official. Who would believe my word against his?" "Mine," Benjamin said simply. "And I know others who have had dealings with him. He tried something similar with the widow Thompson last year, before her sons arrived from Missouri. She didn't say much, but word gets around in small towns." He settled his hat back on his head with a determined gesture. "I'm going to report him, Miss Ellsworth. To the land office in Houston, to the territorial governor if necessary. But I'll need documentation, witnesses, evidence that your claim meets every legal requirement." Faith felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, replaced by a flutter of hope that felt almost painful after the despair of the past hour. "You would do that? For me?" Benjamin's expression softened, and he took a step closer. "I'd do it because it's right. But I'd be lying if I said my reasons were entirely altruistic." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've been meaning to call on you properly, Miss Ellsworth, but a woman building a homestead doesn't have much time for social visits, and I didn't want to presume. But the truth is, I've admired you since the first time I saw you plowing that north field in the rain, because you needed to get the planting done before the weather turned. You're the strongest person I've ever met, man or woman, and what Blackthorn is doing is not just illegal. It's an insult to everything you've accomplished." Faith stared at him, her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sincerity she saw in his face. She'd been alone for so long, had convinced herself that survival was enough, that she didn't need anything beyond her land and her independence. But standing here in the fading afternoon light, with this good man offering not just help but genuine respect and something that looked remarkably like admiration, she felt the walls she'd built around herself begin to crack. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, "except thank you. And yes, I would be grateful for your help. I have all my documentation, records of every improvement, receipts for materials, everything the land office requires." "Good," Benjamin said. "Then let's gather it all together and I'll take it to Houston myself. I have contacts in the land office, people I served with during my time in the territorial militia. They're honest men, and they'll listen." He hesitated, then added, "But this might take some time, and Blackthorn has 30 days to file his report on your claim. We need to move quickly and carefully." They spent the next hour inside Faith's cabin, spreading documents across her table while she showed Benjamin every piece of paper she'd carefully preserved over 3 years of homesteading. There were receipts from the lumber mill in Huntsville, records of seed purchases, a ledger where she'd meticulously tracked every dollar spent and earned, and a journal where she'd documented each improvement with dates and detailed descriptions. Benjamin examined everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what would be needed to build a case against a corrupt official. and Faith found herself watching him as much as the papers, noting the careful way he handled her possessions, the serious attention he gave to her words. "You're more organized than most lawyers I've known," he said with a smile that transformed his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. "Blackthorn won't have a leg to stand on when they see this documentation. You've exceeded every requirement by a significant margin." "My father was a clerk back in Ohio," Faith explained, allowing herself to relax slightly as she poured them both coffee from the pot on her stove. "He taught me that written records are the only way to prove truth when people try to rewrite history to suit themselves. I never thought I'd be dealing with government corruption when I filed my claim, but I'm grateful for his lessons now." Benjamin accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, his fingers brushing hers briefly in the exchange. The contact was brief and innocent, but Faith felt it like a spark of electricity, a reminder that she was still a woman despite the calluses on her hands and the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. "Your father was a wise man," Benjamin said, "and he raised a daughter with the courage to stand alone in a world that doesn't make it easy for women to claim independence. Sometimes I wonder if courage is just another word for stubbornness," Faith admitted, settling into the chair across from him. "There were times when I thought about giving up, going back east to find work as a seamstress or a teacher. But this land, this place I've built, it's mine in a way nothing else has ever been." "Does that make sense?" "More than you know," Benjamin said quietly. "I bought my ranch after years of working as a hired hand on other people's property. There's something about owning land, about knowing that what you build will last, that changes everything. It roots you to a place and a purpose." He took a sip of coffee, then met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But land isn't everything. I've learned that a place is just empty prairie without someone to share it with, without someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear as the winter sunlight streaming through the window. Faith felt her pulse quicken, felt a yearning she'd suppressed for so long rise up in her chest like flood water breaking through a dam. But she forced herself to focus on the immediate crisis, on the practical matters that needed addressing before she could even think about the possibility of something more. "What happens if Blackthorn retaliates when you report him?" she asked. "He has power, connections." "What if he makes things difficult for you?" Benjamin's expression hardened. "Let him try. My ranch is paid for, my accounts are in order, and I have enough friends in this county that he'd have trouble causing real damage. Besides, men like Blackthorn are cowards at heart. They prey on people they think can't fight back. When faced with someone willing to stand up to them, they usually fold." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his gaze steady and sure. "But I won't lie to you, Miss Ellsworth. There's some risk involved. He might try to rush through a rejection of your claim before the investigation can proceed. That's why I need to leave for Houston at first light tomorrow. The faster we can get this in front of honest officials, the better." "Then you should take the documents with you tonight," Faith said, making the decision even as fear clutched at her heart at the thought of her precious records leaving her possession. "I trust you, Mr. Crawford. I don't say that lightly, but I do." Benjamin reached across the table and took her hand in his, the gesture both comforting and thrilling in its intimacy. His palm was warm and calloused from work, his grip firm but gentle. "I'll guard these papers like they're gold, and I'll fight for your claim like it's my own. You have my word on that, and my word is something I don't give lightly either." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, and Faith felt something shift between them, some barrier falling away to reveal the connection that had been building quietly over months of neighborly encounters and stolen glances across property lines. She'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't let herself acknowledge the attraction, the way her heart lifted when she caught sight of him riding his fence line, the disappointment when weeks passed without a visit. But now, with her future hanging in the balance and this good man offering not just help but partnership, she couldn't deny what she felt anymore. "Would you stay for supper?" she asked, her voice softer than she'd intended. "It's just stew and cornbread, nothing fancy, but it's the least I can offer after everything you're doing." Benjamin's smile was slow and genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. "I'd be honored, Miss Ellsworth. Though I should warn you, my own cooking has been so bad these past months that anything you've made will taste like heaven by comparison." Faith laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness after the heavy fear of earlier. "You're setting the bar pretty low, Mr. Crawford." "Benjamin," he said, "if we're going to be working together to fight corrupt government officials, we should probably use first names." "Benjamin," Faith repeated, liking the way it felt in her mouth. "Then you should call me Faith." "Faith," he said, and the way he said her name with such warmth and respect made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "It suits you. After all, it takes faith to build something lasting in uncertain times." She rose to prepare the meal, and Benjamin helped without being asked, moving around her small kitchen with an easy competence that spoke of a man accustomed to caring for himself. They worked in companionable near silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that usually took years to develop between people. And Faith found herself thinking that perhaps her father had been right about more than just the importance of documentation. He'd always said that the truest measure of a person's character came through in small actions, in how they treated others when there was nothing to gain from kindness. Benjamin Crawford was proving himself to be exactly the kind of man her father would have approved of, and that thought brought both joy and a piercing sadness that her parents hadn't lived to see this day. Over supper, they talked about practical matters at first, about the route Benjamin would take to Houston, the officials he'd contact, the strategy for presenting Faith's case. But as the meal progressed and the light outside faded to twilight, their conversation drifted to more personal territory. Faith learned that Benjamin had grown up on a small farm in eastern Texas, that he'd lost his parents to cholera when he was 19, and that he'd spent nearly a decade working various ranches from the Gulf Coast to the Northern Territories before saving enough to buy his own place. "Why Madisonville?" Faith asked, genuinely curious about what had drawn him to this particular patch of Texas prairie. Benjamin considered the question while he finished his coffee. "I passed through here 5 years ago driving cattle to market, and something about the land spoke to me. It's not the richest soil or the best grazing, but there's room here to grow, to build something that could last generations. And the town, small as it is, has good people. That matters more than rich land in my experience. You can improve soil, but you can't change the character of your neighbors." "That's a thoughtful answer," Faith said. "Most men I've known only think about immediate profit." "My father used to say that a man who only thinks about today will always be poor, even if he has money," Benjamin replied. "Wealth is about what you leave behind, what you build that outlasts you. I want to create something that matters, something my children and grandchildren could be proud of." He paused, a slight flush rising to his weathered cheeks. "If I'm fortunate enough to have them someday." Faith felt her own face warm at the implication. The conversation had taken a decidedly personal turn, but she found she didn't mind. There was something refreshing about Benjamin's directness, the way he spoke openly about hopes and dreams most men kept hidden behind gruff exteriors. "That's a worthy goal," she said softly. "I think about that sometimes, about what this place could become in 20 or 50 years if I can hold on to it, whether it could be something bigger than just my survival." "It already is," Benjamin said with conviction. "You're proving that women can claim and keep land under the Homestead Act, that the law means what it says about treating all citizens equally. Every woman who files a claim after you will have an easier time because of what you've accomplished. That's a legacy worth fighting for." His words struck something deep in Faith's chest, a recognition that he understood her struggle in a way most people didn't. So many folks in Madisonville viewed her homestead as either a curiosity or a temporary aberration, something that would inevitably fail because women weren't meant to farm alone. But Benjamin saw the larger implications, understood that her success mattered beyond her personal circumstances. It was perhaps the most attractive thing about him, even more than his handsome face or strong shoulders, this ability to see past convention to the deeper truths beneath. They lingered at the table long after the meal was finished, talking about everything from farming techniques to books they'd read to memories of their families. Faith found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years, small moments from her childhood that her parents' deaths had made almost too painful to remember. But with Benjamin listening with such genuine interest, those memories felt less like ghosts and more like treasures she could finally unwrap and examine in the light. It was fully dark when Benjamin finally rose to leave, gathering the carefully wrapped bundle of Faith's documents with the solemnity of someone accepting a sacred trust. At the door, he paused and turned back to her, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the cabin. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he said. "With any luck within a week with good news. But Faith, I need you to be careful while I'm gone. Don't be alone with Blackthorne if he comes back. If you see him approaching, ride to the Hendersons' place or the Morgans. Make sure there are witnesses to any interaction." "I'll be careful," Faith promised, though the thought of Blackthorne returning made her skin crawl. "And Benjamin, thank you, not just for helping with this, but for understanding what it means to me." He reached out and took her hand again, holding it gently between both of his. "I mean what I said earlier. My reasons aren't entirely altruistic. When I get back, when this is settled, I'd like to call on you properly, court you if you'd be willing. I know the timing isn't ideal, but life rarely offers perfect moments, and I've learned not to wait for them." Faith's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it in the quiet night. She'd had suitors before, back in Ohio, but none had ever made her feel this combination of safety and excitement, of being both cherished and respected as an equal. "I'd like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like that very much." Benjamin lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and romantic that Faith felt her knees weaken slightly. "Then I'll ride faster knowing I have something beyond justice waiting for me when I return." He released her hand reluctantly and stepped out into the night, swinging up into his saddle with practiced ease. "Lock your doors, Faith, and don't hesitate to fire a warning shot if anyone gives you trouble. Sound carries in these parts." Faith watched until he disappeared into the darkness, then went back inside and did indeed lock the door, something she rarely bothered with. She leaned against the solid wood and let herself feel the full weight of everything that had happened in one extraordinary day. This morning she'd been facing ruin and humiliation at the hands of a corrupt official, and tonight she had an ally, a champion, and the possibility of something that looked remarkably like love blossoming in the most unlikely circumstances. She prepared for bed in a daze, her mind spinning with thoughts of Benjamin's earnest face, his strong hands handling her precious documents with such care, the way he'd said her name like it was something valuable. She'd been alone for so long, had built such high walls around herself in the name of strength and independence, but those walls felt less like protection now and more like prison bars. Maybe, she thought as she slipped between her quilts, maybe there was a way to be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and partnered. Maybe Benjamin Crawford could be the kind of man who understood that loving a woman didn't mean diminishing her. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams a confused mixture of Blackthorn's leering face and Benjamin's steady gaze, of her land stretching endlessly in all directions, and then suddenly being taken away. She woke before dawn feeling restless and unsettled, and threw herself into work as the best remedy for worry. There were always chores on a homestead, endless tasks that demanded attention, and Faith attacked them with more vigor than usual, trying to exhaust herself enough that anxiety couldn't find purchase. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Faith worked from dawn until well past dark, tending her animals, mending fence line, preparing her fields for spring planting. But underneath every action was the constant awareness that her entire future hung in balance, dependent on Benjamin's success in Houston and the willingness of distant officials to care about justice. She'd told no one except Benjamin about Blackthorn's proposition, too ashamed and angry to discuss it even with the few women in town she considered friends, but the secret felt like a weight pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. On the fourth day after Benjamin's departure, Cornelius Blackthorn returned. Faith saw him approaching across the prairie in late afternoon, his official survey wagon pulled by a pair of glossy horses that looked far too expensive for a government employee's salary. She immediately saddled her mare and rode to the Hendersons' neighboring homestead, as Benjamin had instructed, and convinced Margaret Henderson to return with her on the pretense of borrowing some preserving jars. Blackthorn was waiting at her cabin when they arrived, his round face arranged in an expression of false concern that made Faith want to slap him. He was perhaps 45, with thinning hair pomaded back from a high forehead and soft hands that had clearly never done a day's real labor. His suit was too fine, his watch chain too gold, everything about him speaking of graft and corruption. "Miss Ellsworth," he said with exaggerated politeness, tipping his hat to both women, "I was hoping to have a private word about your claim." "Anything you need to say can be said in front of Mrs. Henderson," Faith replied coolly, dismounting but keeping her distance. "She's helping me with some canning today." Blackthorn's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the defensive maneuver for what it was, but he maintained his false, pleasant demeanor. Of course. I simply wanted to check on a few final details before I submit my report. There are some questions about whether your improvements meet the minimum value requirements. The lumber for your barn, for instance, where exactly did you source that?" Faith listed the mills she'd used, the dates of purchase, the costs per board foot. She'd memorized every detail of her expenditures, had rehearsed this information so many times that it flowed without hesitation. Blackthorn listened with a bored expression, occasionally interrupting to ask increasingly specific and irrelevant questions clearly designed to trip her up or find some minor inconsistency he could exploit. Margaret Henderson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd homesteaded with her husband 20 years earlier, watched the exchange with growing suspicion. "Mr. Blackthorn," she finally interrupted, "I've been through 3 homestead inspections with my own claim and my children's, and I've never heard an inspector ask such detailed questions about lumber sources. Miss Ellsworth's improvements are clearly substantial and permanent. What's the real issue here? Blackthorn's pleasant mask slipped slightly, revealing irritation beneath. Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your interest, but Homestead evaluation is a complex process that requires thoroughness. Miss Ellsworth is a single woman attempting to prove up a claim without the usual assistance of a husband or family. Additional scrutiny is warranted in such cases. Additional scrutiny or additional obstacles? Margaret asked bluntly. Because it seems to me like you're inventing problems where none exist. This is as fine a homestead as any in Madison County, and you'd approve it in an instant if Faith were a man. Faith felt a rush of gratitude for Margaret's intervention, but also fear that Blackthorn would retaliate against both of them. I've provided all required documentation, she said firmly. Every receipt, every record, everything the land office requires. If there are specific deficiencies, please outline them in writing so I can address them. Blackthorn's face flushed an ugly red. I don't take orders from homesteaders, Miss Ellsworth, and I'd advise you to remember that I hold your future in my hands. A more cooperative attitude might serve you better. His gaze flicked to Margaret, then back to Faith. I'll be submitting my report to the land office within the week. I suggest you think carefully about whether you've truly met all requirements, including those unwritten expectations that help facilitate approval. With that thinly veiled threat, he climbed back into his wagon and drove away, leaving Faith and Margaret standing in a cloud of dust. Margaret put a hand on Faith's shoulder, her expression a mixture of sympathy and fury. That man is corrupt as they come. Please tell me you're doing something about this. Faith nodded, blinking back angry tears. Benjamin Crawford is in Houston right now, reporting him to the land office and presenting my documentation to honest officials. I just have to hold on until he gets back. Margaret's expression softened with understanding and something that looked like approval. Benjamin Crawford is a good man. If anyone can navigate the bureaucracy and get you justice, he can. And Faith, that man is clearly interested in more than just your homestead claim. I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. Is it that obvious? Faith asked, feeling her cheeks heat despite the seriousness of the situation. Only to those of us who remember what it's like to be young and find someone worth keeping, Margaret said with a gentle smile. And there's no shame in it. You've been alone out here for 3 years, working yourself to the bone. It's past time you had someone to share the load with and to share the joys when the work is done. They went inside and actually did some canning, putting up preserves from the root vegetables Faith had stored through the winter. The familiar domestic work was soothing, and Margaret's steady presence helped calm Faith's jangled nerves. They talked about everything except Blackthorn, discussing spring planting strategies and the upcoming barn raising at the miller's place. And by the time Margaret left as evening fell, Faith felt more settled. But that night, lying in her bed and staring at the ceiling, Faith couldn't stop replaying Blackthorn's words and tone, the thinly veiled threats and the humiliation of being reduced to a supplicant begging for what she'd rightfully earned. She thought about Benjamin traveling through the night toward Houston, carrying her precious documentation and her hopes. She wondered what he was doing at that exact moment, whether he was thinking of her, whether he'd meant the things he'd said about courting her, or if that had just been kindness extended to someone in desperate circumstances. The doubts circled like vultures, until Faith forced herself to remember the way Benjamin had looked at her across the dinner table, the sincerity in his voice when he'd spoken about building a legacy, the gentle pressure of his lips against her knuckles. Those weren't the actions of a man simply being polite. Those were the actions of someone who cared, who saw her as more than just a neighbor in need of rescue. 2 more days crawled past, each hour feeling like a week. Faith worked compulsively, pushing herself until exhaustion forced sleep that was too deep for dreams or worry. She saw Blackthorn's wagon pass on the main road twice, but he didn't stop, and she took grim satisfaction in imagining him returning to town uncertain whether she'd been intimidated into submission, or if she had some plan he didn't know about. On the 7th day after Benjamin's departure, Faith was repairing the gate on her chicken coop when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. She looked up to see Benjamin galloping toward her on his gray gelding, his hat pulled low, but his posture radiating triumph even from a distance. Faith dropped her hammer and ran to meet him, her heart suddenly light as bird bones. Benjamin reined in his horse in a spray of dirt and swung down before the animal had fully stopped, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. Without thinking, without planning, Faith threw her arms around his neck, and he caught her around the waist, lifting her clean off her feet as he spun her in a circle. They were both laughing, giddy with relief and victory, and when he set her down they stood close enough that Faith could see gold flecks in his sage-colored eyes. "It worked," Benjamin said, his voice rough with emotion and travel exhaustion. "Everything worked, Faith. I filed a formal complaint with the land office, and it turns out there were already 3 other complaints about Blackthorn on file that no one had pursued because the claimants were afraid to push the matter. But with your documentation and my testimony, they had enough to launch an immediate investigation. They've suspended Blackthorn from duty pending a hearing, and they assigned a new inspector to your case who reviewed all your records while I was still in Houston." Faith felt tears spring to her eyes, relief so intense it was almost painful flooding through her. "And," Benjamin's grin was wide enough to split his face, "and your claim is approved, Faith. Fully, completely, officially approved. You own your land free and clear, 160 acres of Madison County, Texas. No one can take it from you now." Faith burst into tears, all the fear and stress and exhaustion of the past week pouring out in great shaking sobs. Benjamin pulled her against his chest and held her while she cried, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances that it was over, that she was safe, that she'd won. And Faith clung to him like a drowning woman to a lifeline, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart under her ear, and knew that she'd found something far more valuable than approved homestead papers. When her tears finally subsided, Faith pulled back slightly and looked up at him, suddenly aware of how completely improper they must look, embraced in full daylight where any passing neighbor could see. But she found she didn't care about propriety, not after what they'd been through together. "How can I ever thank you?" she asked, her voice still shaky. "You saved me, Benjamin. You saved everything I've worked for." "You saved yourself," Benjamin corrected gently, using his thumb to wipe away the tears on her cheeks. "I just carried papers and talked to officials. You're the one who built something worth saving, who had the courage to refuse Blackthorn's demands even when you thought it might cost you everything. That's real strength, Faith. That's the kind of character that changes the world." "I was terrified," Faith admitted. "I'm still terrified, honestly. What if Blackthorn retaliates? What if he comes after me or you?" "He won't," Benjamin said with certainty. "The investigators made it clear that any attempt to interfere with witnesses or claimants would result in criminal charges, not just dismissal. Blackthorn is finished and he knows it. He's probably already left the county to avoid prosecution." He hesitated, then added, "And even if he was foolish enough to try something, he'd have to go through me first. I know I have no official right to protect you, Faith, but I'm hoping you'll give me that right. I'm hoping what I said before I left still holds true." Faith's heart hammered against her ribs as she understood what he was asking. "About courting me." "About courting you," Benjamin confirmed. "About building something together that's bigger than two separate homesteads. About partnership and love, and all the complicated, messy, wonderful things that come with sharing your life with someone." He took both her hands in his expression earnest and vulnerable in a way she suspected few people ever saw. "I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other in some ways. But Faith, I've never been more certain of anything than I am about wanting to know you better, about wanting to stand beside you for whatever comes next." Faith felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump without knowing how deep the water below ran. Every instinct she'd developed over 3 years of solitary survival screamed caution, warned her not to trust, not to need, not to let someone else become necessary to her happiness. But looking at Benjamin's honest face, feeling the warmth of his hands around hers, she realized that caution and fear had kept her alive, but they'd also kept her only half living. Maybe it was time to risk something bigger than Homestead approval. Maybe it was time to risk her heart. "I'm not easy to be with," Faith warned him. "I'm stubborn and independent, and I have strong opinions about how things should be done. I've been making my own decisions for so long that I'm not good at compromise." "I'm not asking you to be easy," Benjamin said with a slight smile. "I'm asking you to be yourself, complicated and strong and stubborn as you are. I don't want a woman who'll simply agree with everything I say, Faith. I want a partner who'll challenge me and keep me honest and build something extraordinary beside me, not behind me." "I won't give up my land," Faith said, needing to make that clear from the start. "Even if this goes where I think you're hoping it will go, I worked too hard for this place to just fold it into someone else's holdings and disappear." "I wouldn't ask you to," Benjamin replied seriously. "Your homestead is yours, legally and morally. If we build a future together, it will be built on mutual respect and shared decision-making, not on me absorbing what's yours into what's mine. I've seen too many marriages where the woman becomes invisible, loses her identity and her agency, and I swear to you that's not what I want." He squeezed her hands gently. "I want a wife who's also a full partner, someone I can trust to run things when I'm not there, someone whose opinion matters as much as mine. Can you trust me enough to try, wife?" The word hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Faith had barely let herself imagine being courted, let alone married, but Benjamin had leaped straight to the heart of the matter with characteristic directness. And maybe that was better, she thought. Maybe after everything they'd been through, the trust they'd already built was worth more than months of conventional courting rituals. "I can try," Faith said softly. "I want to try, Benjamin. You're right that it's fast, but I've also learned that life doesn't wait for perfect timing. If the past week taught me anything, it's that the things worth having are worth taking risks for." Benjamin's smile was like sunrise, transforming his entire face with joy. He pulled her close again, and this time when Faith rested her head against his chest, it felt less like seeking shelter and more like coming home. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other under the wide Texas sky, and Faith felt something settle in her chest that had been restless and unsettled for years. "I should probably do this properly," Benjamin said eventually, pulling back enough to look down at her. "My mother raised me better than to skip straight to wedding talk without proper steps in between. Faith Ellsworth, may I have permission to court you with the intention of marriage, to call on you regularly, to take you to church socials and town events, to learn your favorite things and share mine. To prove to you over time that I mean every word I've said today," Faith laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "Benjamin Crawford, yes. Yes to all of it. Though I should warn you my social calendar is fairly limited. Homesteading doesn't leave much time for dancing." "Then we'll have to make time," Benjamin said decisively. "You've spent 3 years doing nothing but survive, Faith. You deserve some joy to go along with the work. Let me give you that. Let me show you what your life could be like with someone to share both the burdens and the celebrations." They went inside her cabin, and Faith made fresh coffee while Benjamin unpacked the official documents from his saddlebags with the ceremony they deserved. The land patent bearing her name, the inspector's approval report, the official seal of the United States government confirming her ownership of 160 acres. Faith spread them out on her table and just stared at them. These pieces of paper that represented 3 years of her life. That proved she'd done what so many people said was impossible for a woman alone. "I need to get these to town and file them with the county clerk," she said, practical even in the midst of overwhelming emotion. "Make sure everything is properly recorded." "We'll go tomorrow," Benjamin suggested. "Together. And while we're there, we can let people know we're courting." "No sense hiding it if we're serious about this." Faith nodded, appreciating his straightforward approach. Small towns ran on gossip, and trying to keep a courtship secret would only fuel speculation and rumor. Better to be honest and direct from the start. "People will talk," she warned. "About it being too fast, about me using you to secure my claim, about you taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. You know how it is." "Let them talk," Benjamin said with a shrug. "People who matter will see the truth, and people who don't matter don't deserve our energy. Besides, I have a feeling you and I are both strong enough to weather a little gossip." They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and practical details about their respective properties and plans. Benjamin's ranch was larger than Faith's homestead, nearly 500 acres that he'd purchased from a widow selling after her husband's death. He raised cattle primarily, with some horses, and had been gradually improving the property's infrastructure. His house was comfortable but basic, built by the previous owner and functional rather than charming. "I'd be lying if I said I haven't imagined what it would look like with a woman's touch," Benjamin admitted, as late afternoon faded toward evening. "With curtains in the windows and a garden planted out front, with children playing in the yard and maybe a swing hanging from that big oak by the creek. But those are just dreams until there's someone to share them with." Faith felt her throat tighten at the picture he painted, at how easily she could see herself in that vision. "I've had similar thoughts," she confessed. "Late at night when the loneliness gets heavy, I imagine what it would be like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day. To share meals with, to plan futures with, to build something bigger than just survival. But I convinced myself those were foolish dreams, that independence meant giving up softer things." "Independence doesn't mean isolation," Benjamin said gently. "You can be strong and still need people, Faith. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that asking for help isn't weakness. It's wisdom, recognizing that humans weren't meant to go through life completely alone." Before Benjamin left that evening, he helped Faith secure her official documents in a tin box she kept hidden under a floorboard in her bedroom, an extra precaution against fire or theft. As they worked together in the small space, Faith was acutely aware of his presence, of how large he seemed in her tiny cabin, how the air felt charged with possibility and promise. At the door, Benjamin paused and cupped her face in his hands with such tenderness that Faith felt tears prick her eyes again. "I'll be here at dawn tomorrow to ride to town with you. And Faith, I want you to know that no matter what happens going forward, no matter how this courtship unfolds, helping you was the right thing to do. You've become important to me in ways I'm still figuring out how to articulate, but I want to figure it out with you." Faith turned her face into his palm, a gesture of trust and affection that felt natural despite how new this all was. "I'm glad you passed through Madisonville 5 years ago and decided this was where you wanted to root yourself. I'm glad our properties border each other. I'm glad you have integrity and courage. I'm just glad for you, Benjamin." He kissed her forehead, a chaste, gentle kiss that still managed to send warmth flooding through Faith's entire body. Then he was gone, riding into the twilight toward his own ranch, and Faith stood in her doorway watching until she couldn't see him anymore. When she finally went inside and prepared for bed, she felt more settled than she had in months, maybe years. The crisis with Blackthorn was resolved, her land was secured, and she'd found something unexpected and precious in the midst of chaos. She pulled out her journal that night and wrote for the first time in weeks, documenting everything that had happened from Blackthorn's initial proposition, through Benjamin's heroic intervention, to this tentative beginning of something that felt like it could change her entire life. Her father had taught her to record the important moments, and Faith suspected she'd want to remember this day decades from now, would want to trace back to this exact point where survival transformed into actual living. The ride to town the next morning was comfortable and easy, with conversation flowing naturally between them. They talked about everything from politics to favorite foods, learning each other's opinions and quirks. Benjamin made Faith laugh with stories about his early days as a cowhand, the mistakes and mishaps that came with learning a trade through trial and error. Faith shared memories of the journey west with her parents, the mixture of fear and excitement that came with chasing dreams across a continent. Madisonville was a small town, barely big enough to support a general store, a church, a saloon, and the county clerk's office that doubled as the land records repository. They filed Faith's papers with the clerk, a meticulous older man named Horace Carver, who examined every document with the thoroughness of someone who took his job seriously. "Everything appears in order," he pronounced finally, affixing his official seal to the county copy. "Congratulations, Miss Ellsworth. It's not common for a single woman to successfully prove up a claim, but you've certainly done so. This is properly recorded now, and your ownership is secure." Faith felt another wave of relief, made sweeter by Benjamin's presence beside her and his hand resting supportively at the small of her back. "Thank you, Mr. Carver. I appreciate your diligence." As they left the clerk's office, they nearly collided with Cornelius Blackthorn on the wooden sidewalk. He looked diminished somehow, his usual arrogance replaced by barely controlled fury. He glared at Benjamin with undisguised hatred, then turned his attention to Faith. "I hope you're satisfied," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You've ruined my career, destroyed my reputation, all because you were too prudish to understand how business really works." Benjamin moved slightly in front of Faith, his posture protective but not aggressive. "You ruined your own career by abusing your position and preying on vulnerable people, Blackthorn. Miss Ellsworth simply refused to be victimized. If you had any honor at all, you'd recognize that and accept responsibility for your actions." Blackthorn's face flushed an ugly purple. "Honor? You talk about honor while stealing another man's woman." "I was never your woman," Faith said sharply, stepping around Benjamin to face Blackthorn directly. She refused to let this coward see her intimidated. "I was never anyone's woman but my own. And I earned my approval through hard work and legal compliance, not through whatever corrupt system you've been operating. I hope the investigation exposes everyone you've exploited, and I hope you face real consequences." For a moment, Blackthorn looked like he might physically attack them, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. But several townspeople had stopped to watch the confrontation, and he seemed to realize that violence would only make his situation worse. Instead, he pushed past them roughly and stalked toward the saloon, leaving Benjamin and Faith standing in the aftermath of the ugly encounter. "Are you all right?" Benjamin asked quietly, scanning her face with concern. Faith nodded, though her heart was racing. "I'm fine. Actually, I'm better than fine." I stood up to him, Benjamin. I didn't back down or let him make me feel small. That feels good, even if he's too much of a coward to understand what he's done wrong. Benjamin's expression was equal parts pride and admiration. "You're remarkable, you know that." Most people would have been shaking after a confrontation like that, but you faced him down like a warrior. They spent the rest of the morning in town, purchasing supplies Faith needed for spring planting and accepting congratulations from various townspeople who'd heard about her approved claim. News traveled fast in small towns, and it seemed everyone had an opinion about the scandal involving Cornelius Blackthorn and Faith's courageous stand against corruption. Many of the women, in particular, sought Faith out to express their support and share their own stories of being dismissed or undermined by male officials. Margaret Henderson found them at the general store and pulled Faith into a fierce hug. "I heard your claim was approved. I'm so happy for you, dear. And I see you took my advice about Benjamin Crawford," she added with a knowing smile at how close Faith and Benjamin stood together. Faith felt her cheeks warm but didn't deny it. "He's courting me," she said simply. "With intention toward marriage if things work out the way we both hope." Margaret beamed. "That's wonderful news. You two are well matched, I think. Both strong, both honorable, both stubborn enough to make it work even when times are hard." She lowered her voice, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "And between you and me, I heard Blackthorn has been ordered to leave Madison County pending his hearing in Houston. Good riddance to corrupt officials, I say." The confirmation that Blackthorn was leaving lifted a weight Faith hadn't realized she was still carrying. With him gone, she could truly move forward without constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for retaliation that would never come. Benjamin drove Faith's wagon home while she rode her mare, and they made plans for the coming weeks as they traveled. Benjamin needed to prepare for spring roundup, the annual gathering and branding of cattle that required all hands on deck for several weeks. Faith needed to complete her planting and make repairs to her barn roof before the spring rains arrived in force. But they agreed to spend Sunday afternoons together, to attend church as a couple and let the community see their courtship developing naturally. True to his word, Benjamin became a constant presence in Faith's life over the weeks that followed. He arrived most evenings after completing his own work to help with her heavier chores, mending fence or hauling lumber, or assisting with projects that were difficult for one person alone. Faith reciprocated by cooking meals large enough for two, and helping Benjamin with tasks around his ranch when her own work allowed. They fell into an easy rhythm of partnership, learning to work together, to anticipate each other's needs, to communicate without words through glances and gestures. But more than the practical assistance, they were learning each other's hearts. They talked endlessly about everything from theology to politics to their hopes for the future. They discovered shared values around justice and fairness, around the importance of community and the responsibility of those with strength to protect those without. They also discovered differences, places where their opinions diverged, but rather than creating conflict, these differences sparked fascinating discussions that deepened their understanding of both themselves and each other. Benjamin was, Faith discovered, surprisingly well-read for a rancher, with shelves of books in his ranch house that covered everything from agriculture to philosophy. He'd been educated at a small college in Louisiana before his parents died, and he missed the intellectual stimulation of academic discussion. Faith shared his love of reading, and they began trading books, discussing themes and ideas during their evening visits. On Sundays, they attended services at the small white church in Madisonville, sitting together in a pew while the congregation took note of their courtship with varying degrees of approval and curiosity. After church, they often joined other families for potluck dinners, integrating into the social fabric of the community as a couple rather than two isolated individuals. Faith found this belonging surprisingly pleasant, after years of keeping herself separate and protected. 6 weeks into their courtship, Benjamin invited Faith to his ranch for Sunday dinner, promising to demonstrate his much-maligned cooking skills. Faith arrived in early afternoon to find he'd cleaned his house thoroughly and attempted to prepare a roast that was only slightly burned around the edges. The effort was so endearing that Faith felt her heart swell with affection. "I told you my cooking was terrible," Benjamin said ruefully as he carved the somewhat charred meat. "But I wanted to prove I could at least try to take care of myself without starving." "It's perfect," Faith said honestly, touched by the gesture. "You put thought and effort into it, and that matters more than whether the roast is a little crispy." After the meal, they walked down to the creek that ran through Benjamin's property, following a path worn smooth by years of cattle moving to water. The spring afternoon was warm but not hot, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and birds singing in the cottonwoods that lined the creek. Benjamin took Faith's hand as they walked, the gesture natural now, after weeks of growing familiarity. At the creek bank, they sat on a large flat rock and dangled their feet in the cool water. Faith leaned against Benjamin's shoulder, comfortable in silence, listening to the water burble over stones and the wind whisper through grass. This, she thought, was what partnership should feel like. Easy and natural, with space for both conversation and quiet, for both independence and intimacy. "I've been thinking about the future," Benjamin said eventually, his voice thoughtful. "About what it would look like if we combined our properties. Not legally, not in a way that threatens your ownership, but practically. We could run cattle across both homesteads, double our grazing capacity. We could pool resources for improvements that would benefit both places. We could build something really substantial, Faith. Something that could support a family and provide security for generations." Faith considered his words carefully. This was the heart of the matter, the question that had been lurking beneath their courtship from the beginning. Could she trust him enough to intertwine their lives so completely? Could she maintain her independence within a marriage, or would partnership inevitably lead to the subordination she'd spent 3 years escaping? "I need to know something," Faith said slowly. "And I need you to be completely honest with me. If we marry, will you expect me to defer to you in all decisions? Will my opinion matter as much as yours, or will the law that gives you control over a wife's property and person override the partnership you've been talking about?" Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, and Faith appreciated that he was taking her question seriously rather than offering easy reassurance. "I won't lie to you, Faith. The law does give husbands significant power over wives, and I'd be naive to pretend that doesn't matter. But law and practice aren't always the same thing. My parents had a true partnership, where major decisions were made jointly, and my father respected my mother's wisdom even when the law said he didn't have to. That's the marriage I want, the only kind that makes sense to me." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I can't promise perfection. We'll disagree sometimes, probably often. We're both strong-willed and we'll have to learn how to navigate conflict without either of us dominating the other. But I can promise that I'll never use the law to force you into something you don't want. I can promise that your homestead will remain yours, that we'll draw up legal documents protecting your ownership, even within marriage. And I can promise that I'll value your voice and your perspective as much as my own, in every decision we make together. Faith studied his face, searching for any hint of insincerity or hidden agenda. But she saw only the same honesty that had drawn her to him from the beginning, the same integrity that had driven him to risk Blackthorn's wrath to protect her rights. She thought about the past 6 weeks, about how Benjamin had treated her with consistent respect, how he'd listened when she talked about farming techniques and actually implemented her suggestions on his own ranch, how he'd never once implied she was less capable because she was a woman. "I believe you," Faith said finally, "and I want to try. I want to build something with you, Benjamin, not because I need rescuing or protection, but because I think we could create something extraordinary together, something neither of us could build alone." Benjamin's smile was radiant, joy transforming his sun-weathered face into something beautiful. He cupped her face in his hands and leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Faith didn't want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the promise of a future that contained both autonomy and connection. Their first kiss was gentle and searching, a question being asked and answered simultaneously. Benjamin's lips were warm and slightly chapped from sun and wind, and Faith felt the kiss all the way down to her toes. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing a little harder, Faith saw her own wonder reflected in Benjamin's sage-colored eyes. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," Benjamin admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I wanted to wait until I was sure you were ready, until the power imbalance of you being vulnerable had evened out enough that you could choose me freely." Faith felt her heart squeeze at his consideration, at the care he'd taken to ensure she never felt pressured or obligated. "I choose you," she said softly. "Freely and fully, I choose you, Benjamin Crawford." They kissed again, longer this time and deeper, and Faith felt something in her chest unfurl like wings spreading to catch the wind. For 3 years, she'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten how to soar, but Benjamin was reminding her that life could contain more than just endurance. It could contain joy and passion, and the thrilling terror of loving someone enough to risk heartbreak. As the afternoon faded toward evening, they talked about practical matters: when to marry, how to handle the legal complications, where to live. Benjamin suggested a summer wedding, giving them time to prepare both legally and emotionally for the significant changes marriage would bring. They agreed to consult with a lawyer in Houston about drawing up documents that would protect Faith's property ownership even after marriage, and to be transparent with the community about their unusual arrangement. "People will talk," Faith warned again. "About a woman insisting on keeping her property separate, about you agreeing to it. Some will say it means you're weak or that I'm grasping." "Let them talk," Benjamin said with the same confidence he'd shown before. "We're not living our lives for other people's approval, Faith. We're building something that works for us, that honors both of our strengths and needs. Anyone who can't understand that isn't worth our concern." Over the following months, Benjamin and Faith continued their courtship while also preparing for marriage. They made the journey to Houston together, chaperoned by Margaret Henderson, who took the opportunity to visit her daughter's family in the city. There they met with a progressive lawyer who helped them draft documents that would keep Faith's homestead in her name alone, while creating a joint property arrangement for future acquisitions. It wasn't common, and the lawyer warned them that some judges might refuse to honor such agreements, but it was better than nothing. They also used the Houston trip to purchase items for their future household, debating everything from dishes to furniture with the seriousness of people planning a shared life. Faith discovered that Benjamin had surprisingly strong opinions about kitchen layout, while he learned that Faith was particular about the quality of tools and equipment, preferring to invest in items that would last rather than cheaper options that would need frequent replacement. The journey home took 3 days by wagon, and they stopped at small towns along the way, staying in boarding houses that required separate rooms for unmarried travelers. But they spent long hours talking as the wagon rolled across the prairie, and Faith felt her certainty growing with each passing mile. This was right, this partnership they were building. It wasn't conventional, but it was honest and genuine and rooted in mutual respect. They set the wedding date for July 15, 1889, giving them time to complete spring work and prepare for the ceremony. Faith worked with several women from church to sew a wedding dress, a simple but elegant cream-colored gown that she could wear again for special occasions rather than a purely ornamental creation. Benjamin commissioned a carpenter in Huntsville to build new furniture for his house, including a beautiful oak wardrobe he planned to give Faith as a wedding gift. As the wedding approached, Faith found herself experiencing a mixture of excitement and terror that kept her awake at night. She was giving up a certain kind of independence, trusting Benjamin in ways that went against every survival instinct she'd developed. But she was also gaining something precious, a true partner who saw her as an equal, who valued her strength rather than being threatened by it. The night before the wedding, Margaret Henderson hosted Faith at her homestead, as tradition dictated the bride and groom shouldn't see each other before the ceremony. Over tea, Margaret shared wisdom from her own 30-year marriage, advice about compromise and communication and choosing your battles. "Marriage isn't easy," Margaret said honestly. "Even good marriages require work and patience and forgiveness. You'll hurt each other sometimes without meaning to. You'll disagree about things that matter. But if you have respect and genuine affection as your foundation, you can weather almost anything. And Faith, I've watched you and Benjamin together these past months. You have something special, something worth protecting and nurturing. Don't let pride or fear keep you from the happiness you've earned." Faith went to bed that night feeling more settled, more ready for the enormous step she was about to take. She thought about her parents, wished desperately they could be here to see her marry such a good man. They would have approved of Benjamin, she knew. Her father would have appreciated his integrity, her mother his kindness. That thought brought both comfort and sorrow, but mostly comfort. She was honoring their memory by choosing a partner worthy of the values they'd instilled in her. The wedding day dawned clear and hot, as July days in Texas tended to be. The ceremony was held at the church in Madisonville, with most of the county in attendance. Faith walked down the aisle alone, having no father or brother to give her away, and she preferred it that way. She was giving herself to Benjamin freely, not being transferred like property from one man's keeping to another's. Benjamin waited at the altar in a new suit, his hair freshly cut, his eyes never leaving Faith's face as she approached. When she reached his side and took his offered hand, Faith felt a sense of rightness that eliminated the last of her doubts. The minister led them through traditional vows, with one significant addition they'd requested. After Benjamin promised to love and cherish Faith, the minister asked Faith if she took Benjamin as her husband and partner in all things, making explicit the equality they'd agreed to build their marriage upon. "I do," Faith said clearly, her voice carrying through the small church. "As partner and equal, I do." They sealed their vows with a kiss that was chaste but lingering, appropriate for a church full of witnesses, but containing the promise of deeper intimacy to come. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Faith caught Margaret Henderson dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and several other women wore similar expressions of emotional satisfaction. They knew what this marriage represented, the courage it took for both Faith and Benjamin to forge their own path rather than simply accepting convention. The reception was held in the churchyard, with tables laden with food brought by various community members, and dancing that lasted until well after dark. Faith danced with Benjamin first, then with several of the older men from church, while Benjamin danced with the ladies who'd helped with wedding preparations. It was joyful and communal, a celebration not just of their marriage but of the community itself, of the connections that made frontier life bearable and occasionally beautiful. As the party wound down, Benjamin helped Faith into the wagon he'd decorated with ribbons and bells, and they drove through the warm summer night toward his ranch, which was now their ranch. Faith felt a flutter of nerves as they approached, knowing that tonight would mark another significant transition in their relationship. They'd kissed often during their courtship, but they'd kept things relatively chaste, saving greater intimacy for marriage as both custom and their own values dictated. Benjamin seemed to sense her nervousness, and he took her hand as they sat together on the wagon seat. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said quietly. "Tonight, next week, whenever you're comfortable. Marriage is a beginning, Faith, not a deadline. We have the rest of our lives to figure things out." Faith felt some of her tension ease at his consideration. "I'm just nervous," she admitted. "I've been independent for so long that sharing space, sharing a bed, it feels enormous. But I want this, Benjamin. I want all of it with you." At the ranch house, Benjamin carried Faith over the threshold as tradition demanded, though he set her down quickly with a self-deprecating laugh. "I'm stronger than I look, but you're not exactly a feather, and I don't want to start our marriage by dropping you." Faith laughed, the sound easing more of the tension. Inside, the house had been transformed during the past weeks. New curtains hung at the windows. Faith's few possessions had been moved in and integrated with Benjamin's, and the bedroom had been completely reorganized to accommodate two people rather than one solitary man. Benjamin had even put fresh wildflowers on the dresser, a gesture so sweet that Faith felt tears prick her eyes. They prepared for bed somewhat awkwardly, both aware of each other's presence in new ways. But when they finally lay together in the darkness, Benjamin simply pulled Faith against his chest and held her, making no demands, offering only comfort and closeness. "Sleep," he murmured into her hair. "Tomorrow we start figuring out how to live together, but tonight just rest. You're safe here, Faith. Always safe with me." Faith relaxed into his warmth, into the steady beat of his heart under her ear, and felt the last of her walls crumble. This was what she'd been missing, she realized. Not just physical intimacy, though that would come, but this deep sense of belonging, of being known and cherished exactly as she was. She fell asleep feeling more content than she could ever remember being, wrapped in her husband's arms and confident in the future they'd build together. Their first weeks of marriage were an adjustment, as combining two households and two strong personalities inevitably required compromise and patience. They had disagreements about everything from how to organize the kitchen to whether cattle or wheat should be their primary focus. But they learned to argue without cruelty, to listen to each other's perspectives, to find solutions that honored both of their needs. The physical intimacy they'd anticipated developed naturally over those early weeks, tentative at first but growing in confidence and passion as they learned what pleased each other. Faith discovered that Benjamin was a generous and attentive lover, more concerned with her comfort and pleasure than his own. Benjamin found that Faith's strength and independence extended to the bedroom, that she was unafraid to ask for what she wanted and equally willing to explore what he needed. They settled into a rhythm of running the two properties as connected but distinct entities. Faith continued managing her original homestead, making all decisions about planting and improvements, while Benjamin focused on his cattle operation. But they helped each other constantly, sharing labor and resources in a way that benefited both properties. They became known in Madison County as progressive and successful, a model of what marriage could look like when both partners contributed equally. As autumn arrived and the brutal Texas heat finally broke, Faith realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with equal parts joy and terror, the knowledge that she was creating a new life with Benjamin, that their partnership was expanding into family. She told him one evening after supper, simply and directly, and watched his face transform with wonder. "A baby," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "We're going to have a baby. Faith, are you happy about this? I know we didn't plan specifically for this year, but I hoped we'd have children eventually." "I'm happy," Faith assured him, taking his hands in hers. "I'm scared too because so much can go wrong, but I'm happy. This is what I wanted when I imagined a future with you. A family, a legacy, something bigger than just us." Benjamin pulled her into his arms, holding her with exquisite gentleness, as if she'd become suddenly fragile. "I'm going to take such good care of you," he promised. "Whatever you need, Faith, rest, help with work, anything." "I'm pregnant, not broken," Faith said with a laugh. "But I won't turn down some extra help when things get harder." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and into winter. Faith continued working both properties as long as she was able, only gradually reducing her physical labor as her body changed and grew. Benjamin hovered sometimes, worried about her doing too much, but Faith appreciated his concern even when it verged on overprotective. Margaret Henderson visited regularly, bringing wisdom from raising 6 children of her own, and other women from church stopped by with gifts and advice. As Faith's pregnancy became obvious to the community, she noticed something unexpected. Several other women, some married to homesteaders and some to ranchers, began confiding in her about their own dreams and struggles. They spoke of wanting more voice in family decisions, of feeling invisible in their own marriages, of admiring the partnership Faith and Benjamin had built. Faith found herself becoming an informal advisor, sharing strategies for communication and compromise, encouraging women to value their own contributions and demand respect. In late March of 1890, Faith went into labor on a blustery afternoon that threatened rain. Benjamin sent for Margaret Henderson and the midwife from town, then paced the cabin like a caged animal while Faith labored with remarkable calm. The birth was long but uncomplicated, and as dawn broke the next morning, Faith delivered a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. "Samuel Benjamin Crawford," Faith said when Benjamin was finally allowed back into the bedroom and met his son for the first time. "After both our fathers. Does that suit you?" Benjamin could barely speak past the emotion clogging his throat. He touched the baby's tiny hand with one gentle finger, marveling at the perfect miniature person they'd created. "It's perfect. He's perfect. Faith, you're amazing. I've never been more in awe of anyone in my life." They brought Samuel home to the ranch, and Faith transitioned into motherhood with the same determination she'd brought to homesteading. It wasn't easy, balancing the demands of an infant with the work required to run 2 properties, but they managed through teamwork and flexibility. Benjamin took over more of the daily labor, while Faith focused on feeding Samuel and gradually recovering her strength. The baby thrived, growing plump and healthy under their combined care. As Samuel got older and more interactive, Faith watched Benjamin transform into a devoted father, playing with their son, telling him stories, carrying him around the ranch to see cattle and horses. The tenderness Benjamin showed their child touched something deep in Faith's heart, reaffirming every decision that had brought them to this point. Time passed in the way it does for busy families, days and weeks blurring together in endless cycles of work and rest, challenge and triumph. Samuel grew from infant to toddler, beginning to walk and talk, displaying a personality that combined his mother's stubbornness with his father's thoughtful nature. Faith and Benjamin celebrated their second wedding anniversary, then their third, each year deepening the partnership they'd built. News reached them that Cornelius Blackthorne had been convicted of corruption and sentenced to prison, a vindication that felt both satisfying and distant. That chapter of Faith's life seemed like ancient history now, a crisis overcome that had ultimately led to something far better than she'd imagined possible. She still owned her original homestead, still made decisions about its management, but it was now part of a larger operation that provided security and prosperity for her growing family. When Samuel was 2 years old, Faith became pregnant again. This time she was less frightened, more confident in her ability to navigate both pregnancy and motherhood. The second baby, a daughter they named Eleanor Margaret after both of their mothers, arrived in October of 1892 during harvest season. She was smaller than Samuel had been but equally healthy, with reddish gold hair that matched neither parent but hinted at some distant ancestor's coloring. With 2 children, life became exponentially busier. Faith and Benjamin hired help for the first time, bringing on a young couple from town to assist with daily labor. This freed Faith to focus more on the children without completely abandoning the work she loved, and it allowed Benjamin to expand their cattle operation significantly. They prospered in ways that went beyond financial success. The Crawford Ranch became known as a good place to work, where employees were treated fairly and women's contributions were valued equally with men's. Faith's original homestead, still legally hers, became a symbol in Madison County of what women could achieve with determination, and a legal system that upheld their rights. Several other single women filed homestead claims in the years following Faith's approval, and she took quiet pride in having helped open that door wider. As their children grew, Faith and Benjamin made sure to teach them both the value of hard work and the importance of justice. They told Samuel and Eleanor about the homestead struggle, about Cornelius Blackthorne's corruption and Benjamin's intervention, presenting it as a lesson in standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. The children absorbed these values, growing into thoughtful young people who understood that privilege came with responsibility. The years continued their inexorable march. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, though he showed more interest in farming than cattle ranching. Eleanor was spirited and independent like her mother, already at age 5 announcing her intention to own land of her own someday. Faith and Benjamin watched their children with pride and amazement, marveling at the unique people they were becoming. On a summer evening in 1895, Faith and Benjamin sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sun set over prairie they'd built a life upon. Samuel and Eleanor were playing near the barn, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Benjamin reached over and took Faith's hand, a gesture as familiar now as breathing after 6 years of marriage. "You ever regret it?" Benjamin asked quietly. "Giving up some of your independence to build this life with me?" Faith considered the question seriously, as it deserved. "I didn't give up independence," she said finally. "I chose interdependence, which is different. I can still make decisions, still own property, still have my own identity beyond being your wife. But I also have partnership and support and love, which makes everything bigger and better than it was alone. So no, I don't regret it. Not for a moment. Benjamin lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had that first night when he'd promised to help her fight for her land. "I'm the luckiest man in Texas," he said simply. "To have found you, to have convinced you to trust me, to have built this extraordinary life together. Every day I wake up grateful." Faith leaned against his shoulder, content in the way that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. "We built this together," she reminded him. "That's what makes it extraordinary. Not luck, but choice and work and commitment to honoring each other through everything." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play and the shadows lengthen across their land. In that moment, Faith felt the completeness of her life wash over her like a blessing. She'd survived loss and loneliness, fought corruption and won justice, built a homestead and a family that would outlast her. She'd found love with a man who saw her as an equal, who'd stood beside her when standing up meant risk, who'd proven every day since that partnership could be real and lasting. The future stretched before them, full of challenges they'd face together and joys they'd share. There would be more children, eventually grandchildren, the passing of years marked by harvest and birth, and the slow accumulation of a life well lived. But all of that was built on this foundation they'd laid together, on mutual respect and trust earned through action rather than demanded by custom. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Benjamin called the children in for supper and Faith rose to help prepare the evening meal. They moved through their home with practiced efficiency, talking and laughing, creating the small daily moments that formed the texture of married life. And Faith felt, with absolute certainty, that every hardship she'd endured had been worth it to arrive at this place, with this person, building this future. The homestead she'd fought so hard to claim remained hers legally, a tangible reminder of her strength and independence. But the ranch they'd built together, the family they'd created, the partnership they'd forged through crisis and courtship and commitment, that was her real legacy. Not land or cattle or even her children, precious as they were, but the proof that love and respect could create something lasting and true. That a woman could be both strong and soft, both independent and partnered, both herself and part of something larger. In the end, Faith Ellsworth Crawford had everything she dreamed of during those lonely years of homesteading alone, and so much more she hadn't known to dream about. She had land and security, yes, but also love and family and the deep satisfaction of knowing she'd built a life that honored both herself and the man who'd chosen to stand beside her. The corrupt inspector who tried to extort favors had been defeated not just by laws and reports, but by the simple fact that good people had refused to let injustice stand. And in the refusal, in the fighting back, Faith had found not just victory but transformation, the evolution from survivor to someone who truly thrived. As she tucked her children into bed that night, kissing their foreheads and whispering love into their dreams, Faith felt a profound gratitude for the series of events that had brought her to this moment. Even Blackthorn's corruption, as terrible as it had forced her path to cross with Benjamin's in a way that might never have happened otherwise. They might have remained friendly neighbors, nothing more, if crisis hadn't revealed the depth of Benjamin's character and Faith's capacity to trust again. Later, lying in bed with Benjamin's arm around her waist and his breath warm against her neck, Faith allowed herself to fully embrace her happiness. For someone who'd spent 3 years convinced that survival was enough, that asking for more was dangerous temptation, she'd come remarkably far. She'd learned that strength didn't require isolation, that vulnerability could coexist with courage, that love didn't diminish a woman but rather amplified everything good she already possessed. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, not for the first time but never without meaning. "I love you too," Benjamin murmured back, his voice heavy with approaching sleep but clear with sincerity. "Today, tomorrow, always. You and our children are everything that matters to me, Faith. Everything I work for, everything I hope to leave behind. Thank you for trusting me enough to build this life together." Faith closed her eyes, safe and content in ways that had once seemed impossible. Outside, the Texas night surrounded their ranch with stars and silence, the land they'd claimed and cultivated stretching in all directions. Inside, a family slept secure in the home they'd built through partnership and perseverance. And in Faith's heart, a profound peace settled, the knowledge that she'd found not just survival in this wild frontier, but actual happiness, genuine love, and a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. The story that had begun with a corrupt official's demands and a desperate woman's refusal had transformed into something beautiful and lasting, proof that courage and integrity could triumph over exploitation and greed. Faith Ellsworth had stood her ground when it would have been easier to submit, and Benjamin Crawford had stood beside her when it would have been safer to look away. Together, they'd built something rare and precious, a marriage of true equals in a time and place where such partnerships were far from common. As Faith drifted toward sleep, her last conscious thought was gratitude. Gratitude for her strength, for Benjamin's integrity, for the land that had tested her and made her stronger, for the community that had supported them, for the children sleeping down the hall who represented hope and future and the best of what she and Benjamin could create together. She'd fought for her homestead and won far more than land. She'd won freedom, partnership, love, and the chance to build a legacy that would inspire others to fight for their own dreams, no matter how impossible they seemed. The Crawford Ranch would prosper for generations, becoming one of the most successful operations in Madison County. Samuel would eventually take over management of Faith's original homestead, running it as his own while always acknowledging his mother's courage in claiming and keeping it. Eleanor would indeed homestead her own land as an adult, carrying forward her mother's legacy of women as independent landowners. And the story of Faith and Benjamin would be told and retold in Madison County, becoming the kind of tale people shared to prove that love and justice could prevail even against corruption and hardship. But all of that was future, still unwritten on this peaceful night in 1895. For now, there was just this moment, this perfect ordinary evening in a life built through extraordinary courage and sustained through daily commitment to honoring each other. Faith Ellsworth Crawford slept peacefully, surrounded by love, secure in her land and her family, having achieved everything she'd fought for and discovered even more she hadn't known she needed. Her homestead was approved, her claim secured, her legacy assured. But far more important, her heart was full, her life was rich, and her future was bright with promise and hope. She had won not just against Cornelius Blackthorne, but against loneliness and fear, and the limitations society tried to impose on women who dared to claim their own destinies. And in winning, she'd helped pave the way for countless others to follow, to dream their own dreams and fight their own battles and build their own extraordinary lives on the wild Texas frontier.